Literature-loving friends, I want to take you with me on a journey to one of the strangest, most daring, and most emotionally unsettling cinematic experiences I've encountered in recent years. A work that felt less like a film and more like a fevered dream of philosophy, flesh, and fractured identity, stitched together into a visual parable of modern womanhood, desire, and rebirth. When I first watched Poor Things 2023, I felt as though I were wandering inside a novel that had somehow leaked out the pages and taken on color and rhythm and grotesque movement. There was an unsettling sense of recognition, as though the film were showing me some grotesque caricature of the world I already knew but had never been able to articulate, a vision where women's bodies, social structures, and personal freedoms collided in surreal bursts of violence and laughter, all painted across a canvas of absurdist wit. It did not feel like a safe film or a gentle one, but rather something alive, pulsing, and daring me confront its contradictions. I left the theater dazed, my mind still circling the bold audacity of it all, knowing instantly that this was not a story to be consumed passively, but one that demanded to be wrestled with, unpacked, and shared in the language of reflection. The first thing that struck me was not simply the outlandishness of its central conceit, but the way it demanded that we take that conceit seriously. A woman's body, resurrected with the brain of her unborn child, is not just some outlandish Gothic experiment. It is a metaphor loaded with everything that modern life, feminist discourse, and human condition can pile onto it. Yet what made it so powerful was not the grotesquerie of the act, but the humanity that followed, the strange, chaotic, often darkly comic unfolding of a life that seems to oscillate between infantile curiosity and ravenous adult desire. I could not look away because the character at the heart of it all was at once absurd and deeply familiar, a mirror to the ways we stumble through freedom, often unguided, often mocked, yet unrelenting in our appetite for experience. That appetite unsettled me, because it carried within it questions I did not want to answer about the nature of innocence, exploitation, sexuality, and growth. I have always been fascinated by stories where the grotesque becomes beautiful, where ugliness somehow reveals an ecstatic truth. Watching this film, I was reminded of the works of Mary Shelley, of Kafka, of Angela Carter, writers who took the grotesque and used it as a scalpel to open up the human soul. There is something liberating in how the narrative refuses to keep its heroine contained, in how it pushes her outward into the world, and in how it lets her shape herself not by obedience but by relentless trial and error. That felt so familiar to me because isn't that how all of us, in quieter, less dramatic ways, discover who we are? We stumble, we sin, we fall into pleasures and pains, and only in hindsight do we weave those scattered fragments into a story of self. The film doesn't give us the comfort of coherence. It gives us the mess, the chaos, the strange hybrid body and mind, and asks us to look at it as something worth loving, worth honoring, worth following across continents and adventures. What captivated me most was how the film dared to be funny, even in the midst of discomfort. Its humor is not kind. It is biting, grotesque, often vulgar, yet it works precisely because it refuses to allow the subject matter to calcify into solemn tragedy. The absurdity of it all is a shield, a mirror, a way of saying, do not think you can escape laughing at the world, even when the world is cruel. I caught myself laughing at moments I might otherwise have wanted to turn away from, and in those laughs I realized how the film traps us. It makes us complicit, it makes us participate, and it makes us question why we found amusement in something that should horrify. This kind of laughter is deeply literary, the kind you find in satire and in grotesque theater, where the audience is never safe, never absolved, but always implicated. The more I think about it, the more I realize that what unsettled me most was the way the film dissolved categories I normally rely on. What is childhood? What is adulthood? What is innocence? What is corruption? What is liberation? What is exploitation? None of these are stable here. They collapse into one another, sometimes in ways that left me gasping. The character at the center is both a child and an adult, both naive and wise, both victim and agent. And isn't that precisely the truth of human life? That we are never simply one or the other. We carry within us all these states at once, colliding and contradicting, sometimes grotesque, sometimes radiant. That is what made the story so powerful. It refused to let me compartmentalize or simplify. It was messy, and it forced me to accept the mess. Friends, when I think back to my first viewing, I remember the visual world most vividly. The palette of colors was like stepping into an oil paint that had been left too long in the sun. Hues warped, shadows exaggerated, forms twisted, yet all of it strangely alive. It reminded me of the uncanny illustrations in the margins of medieval manuscripts, where grotesque creatures lurked in brightly painted corners, both comic and terrifying. That visual world was not just a backdrop, but an argument, a statement that said, this story is not grounded in realism, but in the imagination's darkest corners. And yet, paradoxically, it felt more truthful than realism could ever be, because it showed me the absurdity and cruelty of human society in heightened, distorted forms. As I tease you toward the plot, I want to say this. Do not expect this story to comfort you or to hand you answers. It will give you questions, contradictions, laughter that stings, beauty that disgusts, and truths that unravel even as you try to hold them. It is a journey that begins in a laboratory with grotesque science and a shocking experiment, and spirals outward into the world. A world of lust, of freedom, of hunger for knowledge, of betrayal, of satire. To follow it is to follow a soul being reborn in every scene, a soul that resists every attempt to pin it down. And it is precisely in that resistance that the film finds its strange, defiant beauty. I invite you now to walk with me into the heart of that chaos, into the story that begins with rebirth and unfolds into a kaleidoscope of adventure, desire, and defiance. When I think about how the story begins to take shape after its unsettling premise, I recall the strange quiet that hung over the theater as the first act unfolded, a quiet charge of both curiosity and unease. The film opens its doors to us in the shadow of Dr. Godwin Baxter, a man whose very name seems to carry the weight of Gothic fable, and through his experiments we are drawn into a house of distortions, a sanctuary of science gone awry. At the center lies Bella, newly resurrected, wandering not with a mind an adult woman, but the restless, chaotic energy of something reborn, learning the world with a hunger that both unsettles and charms. Watching her in those early moments felt like watching a child in a body too large for her spirit, her movements jerky, her words fractured, her gaze wide and bewildered. I remember being startled by how her innocence was not portrayed as sweet, but as disorienting, even frightening, a reminder of how fragile and raw the process of learning to be human truly is. Dr. Baxter himself hovers like a grotesque guardian, a man whose stitched visage seems to mirror the stitched soul he has placed into Bella's body. There is something tragic in him, and yet something manipulative, as though he is both protector and captor. He gives her space to stumble, but also keeps her tethered, observing her like a specimen rather than a daughter. This tension unsettled me, because it made me wonder whether Bella's freedom was truly hers, or whether it was merely another experiment playing out in the mind of a man obsessed with power over life and death. Around them, the house becomes a kind of stage, a sealed-off world where Bella's strange rebirth plays out like a theatrical performance, each scene adding layers to the unsettling spectacle of her existence. As Bella begins to find her footing, the strangeness of her behavior provides both comedy and discomfort. She eats with voracious abandon, stumbles across rooms with chaotic glee, throws tantrums, and laughs with the unfiltered joy of a child discovering sensation for first time. Yet all this unfolds within the body of a grown woman, and the dissonance unsettles everyone around her, including me as a viewer. I remember laughing at her unfiltered outbursts and then catching myself, realizing that the humor was not innocent but disturbing, forcing me to confront how much of human behavior is shaped by social expectations. The film does not let us forget that Bella is both vulnerable and powerful, both unknowing and full of potential, and that paradox keeps every scene taut with unease. Into this world enters Duncan Wedderburn, a man of arrogance and seduction, whose presence becomes the catalyst for Bella's first great departure. Their relationship is grotesque and fascinating to watch unfold, because Duncan believes himself to be the seducer, the teacher, the one in control. Yet what the story makes clear is that Bella's hunger for experience, for freedom, for the pleasures and dangers of the body, quickly overwhelms the roles he imagines for her. I watch their interactions with a mixture of dread and fascination, because on one hand he is exploiting her innocence, but on the other, she refuses to stay within the script of victimhood. She absorbs what she wants, discards what she does not, and grows bolder with each passing encounter. This strange inversion of power unsettles the very structure of their relationship, turning what might have been a tale of exploitation into something messier, harder to categorize, a story of appetite colliding with arrogance. Their escape together from Baxter's house feels like the tearing open of the story's world, the beginning of an odyssey across countries and landscapes. This departure is what I remember most vividly in the first half, because it marked the moment when the laboratory gave way to the broader grotesque carnival of society. Bella, unchained from the confines of one man's control, enters into control of another, yet she twists that control into something unmanageable, something liberating. They embark on a journey of pleasure and indulgence, traveling to Lisbon and beyond, where Bella begins to experience the full weight of human desire, not as something imposed upon her, but as something she seizes for herself. The depiction of Lisbon, with its opulent brothels and decadent nightlife, felt like a descent into a surreal carnival of human appetites. Here, Bella discovers sex not as something shameful, but as something natural, even joyful, and she embraces it with the curiosity and hunger of someone encountering a new language. I remember how unsettling it felt to watch her describe her experiences with the blunt honesty of a child, stripping away all the layers of social pretense and moral judgment that usually surround sexuality. She is not ashamed, not bound by societal rules, and this freedom makes her both terrifying and fascinating to those around her. Duncan begins to falter in this environment, realizing that the woman he thought he controlled cannot be contained. His arrogance crumbles as Bella takes command of her own experiences, her own body, her own narrative. What struck me most was how Bella's journey through these brothels and decadent spaces was not portrayed as degradation, but as liberation. She is unshackled from the hypocrisies of society that demands female submission while exploiting female desire. She takes pleasure for herself, speaks of it without shame, and in doing so, exposes the absurdity of the men around her. Watching her in these moments, I felt both exhilarated and unsettled, because the film refuses to let the audience rest in comfort. It confronts us with questions about freedom, agency, and the politics of the body, questions that resonate far beyond the confines of its surreal story. Of course, liberation is never without consequence, and the more Bella embraces her appetite for experience, the more those around her recoil. Duncan becomes increasingly desperate, realizing that his role in her life is slipping away, that he cannot possess what refuses to be possessed. The irony is delicious, because he entered their relationship assuming dominance, only to find himself outpaced and discarded by the very woman he sought to control. Watching his unraveling was both satisfying and tragic, because it exposed the fragile ego of a man confronted with a woman who does not play by the rules he knows. His jealousy, his fear, his growing irrelevance all play out as Bella continues her journey forward, unrelenting in her hunger for more. By the midpoint of the film, Bella's growth is undeniable. She has shed the awkward movements and childlike fumbling of her earliest days, replacing them with a boldness that is both inspiring and dangerous. She speaks with confidence, pursues pleasure without apology, and begins to understand the structures of society that seek to contain her. Yet with every step forward, she also reveals how precarious freedom is, how easily it can be twisted or punished by the systems around her. The world into which she is plunged is decadent, cruel, and unforgiving, and while her defiance is exhilarating, it is also perilous. The first half of the story, then, is not simply a tale of liberation, but a tale of confrontation. Bella confronts the limitations imposed on her by men, by social norms, by morality, by class. She takes what she wants, discards what she does not, and in doing so exposes the hypocrisies of everyone she meets. Her journey across Lisbon is not just geographic, but symbolic, a passage from innocence to experience, from confinement to expansion. It is a carnival of grotesque freedom, both joyous and unsettling, and it leaves us teetering on the edge of what will come next. As I reflect on these scenes, what lingers is not just the plot points, but the mood they evoked. The unsettling blend of comedy and tragedy, innocence and corruption, freedom and captivity. The film makes us complicit in Bella's journey, daring us to laugh, to recoil, to question our own judgments. It is not a comfortable story, but it is one that refuses to be ignored. And as the first half comes to its close, I felt both exhilarated and afraid, knowing that the second half would push these questions even further, into darker, stranger, and more defiant territory. When the second half of the story unfurls, it feels like stepping off the edge of a map, leaving behind the familiar outlines of pleasure and indulgence that had defined Bella's early adventures and entering into a new territory where freedom collides with responsibility, power, and the realities of the broader world. For me, this shift was both exhilarating and unsettling, because it marked a moment when the narrative deepened into something more profound than a grotesque carnival of experiences. What had begun as a tale of a woman stumbling into freedom now transformed into the story of a woman forging an identity, testing her strength not only against the men who sought to control her, but against the very structures of society itself. Bella's departure from Duncan is one of the turning points that still lingers with me, a moment where liberation crystallizes into defiance. His unraveling had already been foreshadowed, his arrogance eroded by her independence, but when she finally casts him aside, it is not simply an act of rejection, but symbolic tearing away of the old hierarchies that tether women to men. Watching him collapse into a pathetic shell of himself was both grotesquely comic and tragically revealing, because it showed how fragile power truly is when it relies on domination rather than mutual respect. Bella's freedom shines even brighter against the backdrop of his weakness, a reminder that liberation often exposes not only new possibilities, but also the insecurities of those who once claimed control. From there, the story pushes Bella further into the world, and with each step, the scale expands. No longer confined to a single house or even the decadent pleasures of Lisbon, she enters the broader tapestry of society, and the film begins to show us its satirical edge more clearly. We follow her into spaces where politics, poverty, and social hierarchies collide, and in these settings, Bella's presence becomes disruptive, even revolutionary. She begins to see that freedom is not merely personal indulgence, but also a matter of collective struggle, that her body and choices exist within a web of power far larger than the immediate men who sought to claim her. One of the most striking sequences in this half is Bella's time in Paris, where she encounters intellectuals, radicals, and working-class voices that open her eyes to broader injustices. Here, she begins to realize that the liberation she seeks is not just sexual or personal, but political, bound up with the lives of those who are crushed by systems of wealth and class. Watching her embrace this realization reminded me of the way literature often uses the grotesque not merely for shock, but for revelation, showing us that the personal is always political, that the body itself is always a battleground of power. Bella's transformation in these moments felt exhilarating, because she moved beyond being a curiosity or a spectacle and began to shape herself as an agent of change. But the world does not embrace women who refuse to be contained, and soon Bella faces backlash, ridicule, and punishment. The more she defies expectations, the more dangerous the world becomes. There are moments of violence and humiliation that struck me like sharp blows, reminders that freedom always carries a cost. Yet what amazed me was how the film refused to let her be broken. Even in moments of defeat, Bella reclaims her agency, refusing to surrender the self she has fought so chaotically to build. Her resilience is not neat or polished. It is messy, defiant, and sometimes cruel. But it is real, and that reality makes her triumphs feel all the more powerful. Meanwhile, Dr. Baxter's shadow continues to loom, his experiment haunting every step of Bella's journey. The grotesque irony is that while he may have created her new life, he cannot control what she has become. His presence in the second half is less dominant, but more tragic, a reminder of the hubris of men who believe they can play God. Watching Bella transcend his expectations was both satisfying and unsettling, because it forced me to consider the nature of creation itself, whether scientific, artistic, or personal. Once something is brought into the world, it takes on a life of its own, beyond the grasp of its creator, and that truth reverberates through every one of Bella's choices. The climax of the story builds toward a confrontation, not only with individuals, but with society at large. Bella's journey brings her into spaces where her independence is treated as monstrous, where her unashamed appetite for knowledge and pleasure is seen as a threat. Yet instead of retreating, she pushes forward, embracing her contradictions and using them as a weapon against the hypocrisy around her. These scenes felt almost like a grotesque carnival of justice, where laughter, violence, and defiance blur into one another. Watching her stand tall in the face of ridicule and oppression was both inspiring and deeply unsettling, because it exposed how fragile the boundaries of social order truly are when confronted by someone who refuses to play by the rules. By the time the story draws towards conclusion, Bella has transformed so fully that it feels almost impossible to connect her with the stumbling, chaotic figure we first met. Yet the brilliance of narrative lies in reminding us that she is still that figure, still the same body stitched together from grotesque beginnings, still the same mind learning through appetite and error. What has changed is not her essence, but her command over it, her ability to wield it rather than be trapped by it. That realization struck me as profoundly literary, a reminder that growth does not erase our origins but reshapes them, weaving them into the fabric of who we become. As I reflect on the second half, I find myself haunted by its balance of triumph and tragedy. Bella's journey is exhilarating, but it is never simple. Her victories are always tinged with grotesque, her liberation always shadowed by violence and resistance. The film refuses to give us a neat resolution, instead leaving us with the image of a woman who has seized her life fully, even if that life remains chaotic, unsettling, and strange. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of all, that freedom is not about perfection or coherence, but about the messy, defiant act of claiming one's own story in a world that insists on writing it for you. By the end, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated, as though I had accompanied Bella on an odyssey that stretched not just across cities and relationships, but across the very boundaries of human experience. The grotesque science of her beginning had blossomed into a philosophical parable about freedom, identity, and the politics of the body. And though the film closed its doors on her story, I found myself still carrying her defiance with me, still wrestling with the questions she embodied. That is the power of a narrative like this. It does not end when the credits roll, but continues to haunt, to provoke, to unsettle long after we leave the theater. When I sit with the memory of this film and let its strangeness settle into thought, I find myself circling not so much the events, but the people who inhabited them, those vivid, grotesque, yet strangely recognizable figures who gave the story its pulse. To understand the film is to understand its characters, because each of them seems less like a fixed individual and more like a prism refracting some deep facet of human nature. Bella, of course, dominates this prism, but she does so by pulling every other character into her orbit, exposing their flaws, mocking their pretenses, and forcing them to reveal what they would rather keep hidden. Watching them was like watching different masses of society fall away, one by one, until all that remained was a raw, absurd theater of human appetite and power. Bella Baxter is the heart, the flame, the chaos at the center. From the very first moment she stumbles onto the screen, her presence unsettles every boundary we rely on. Child and adult, innocent and experienced, victim and predator, grotesque and beautiful. I found her simultaneously magnetic and disturbing, because she refused to fit into any role I want to give her. At times, she is like a child, throwing tantrums, demanding sweets, laughing uncontrollably at the simplest pleasures. At other times, she is a voracious woman, claiming her body and her desires with unfiltered honesty. What makes her fascinating is that the film never allows her to be either or. She is both at once, a living contradiction, and in that contradiction, she becomes a mirror of our own fractured natures. I realized, watching her, that perhaps none of us ever grow into the coherence we pretend to have. We are all stumbling, half innocent, half knowing, always trying on roles, always discarding them. Bella simply makes visible what most of us keep hidden. Her liberation, too, is complicated. At first, I wanted to see her as a victim who triumphs, a woman reborn into freedom despite the grotesque circumstances of her creation. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became that her journey was not about neatly overcoming victimhood. It was about inhabiting the mess, taking control even when control is slippery, refusing to be ashamed even when shame is demanded. That boldness shocked me, because it refused the comfort of morality tales. She is not good, not pure, not noble. She is free, and that freedom is jagged, unsettling, sometimes cruel. I found myself cheering for her even when she made choices that unsettled me, because her existence alone was an act of defiance against everything the world told her she should be. If Bella is the flame, Dr. Godwin Baxter is a grotesque hand that lit it. His stitched body, his uncanny appearance, his mixture of tenderness and cruelty, all of it create a figure who is as unsettling as the science he performs. He is both father and captor, both protector and manipulator, a man who claims to give life, but does so by bending life to his own experiment. I could never quite decide how to feel about him. At moments, I pitied him, this scarred man who seemed to live on the margins of society, creating a strange sanctuary out of his house of horrors. At other moments, I despised him, recognizing in his experiments the arrogance of men who claim power over life and then dress it up as benevolence. What lingered for me was the sense that Baxter embodies a danger creation without humility, the hubris of playing God without acknowledging that life, once given, belongs to itself. Bella's defiance is a rebuke to his arrogance, the proof that no creator can control what is created. That is a truth that echoes far beyond the walls of his house. Duncan Wedderburn is a character who lingers in my mind as both comic relief and tragic warning. At first, he struts onto the stage as the embodiment of arrogance, a man convinced that his charm and power will let him possess Bella, mold her, control her. Yet watching him unravel is one of the film's most grotesquely satisfying pleasures. He thinks he is a seducer, but he becomes a fool. He thinks he is a master, but he becomes a plaything. There is a delicious irony in his downfall, but also a sadness, because the collapse exposes how fragile masculinity can be when confronted with a woman who refuses submission. Duncan becomes less a man and more a caricature of entitlement. And in his grotesque weakness, the film reveals a wider truth about the arrogance of men who mistake possession for love. I laughed at him, but I also winced because his pathetic collapse reminded me of how real and common such entitlement is in the world beyond the screen. Other characters, too, flicker into the story and leave their imprint. Max McCandles, the timid assistant who longs for Bella with a kind of quiet devotion, embodies a different form of weakness. His desire is not domineering like Duncan's, but it is no less problematic because he cannot truly see Bella as she is. He imagines her as an ideal, a fantasy, a woman to be loved rather than a person to be known. His passivity and timidity make him pitiable. Yet they also reveal how even gentler forms of desire can reduce women to object projection rather than partners of reality. I felt a kind of sorrow for him, but also a recognition that his love, however tender, was still a cage. Even minor figures in Bella's odyssey add layers to the tapestry of meaning. The brothel keepers, the radicals, the strangers she encounters across cities. They each serve as mirrors reflecting society's fascination and fear of her. To some, she is a curiosity, a freak to be observed. To others, she is a threat, a woman whose defiance of social norms endangers the fragile structures of class and gender. To a few, she is an inspiration, a glimpse of freedom that they themselves might never dare to claim. What fascinated me was how Bella seemed to absorb all of these projections, and yet refused to be reduced to them. She remains defiantly herself, shaped by encounters but never defined by them. The beauty of the film's character work lies in how these figures, grotesque as they are, remain recognizably human. I saw in Duncan the fragility of ego, in Baxter the hubris of creation, in Max the blindness of romantic projection, in Bella the raw contradictions of freedom. Each of them unsettled me because I recognized fragments of myself, of people I have known, of the society I live in. That is the uncanny power of grotesque storytelling. It magnifies, distorts, exaggerates, and yet somehow reveals truths we would rather not face. By the end, Bella stands apart from them all, transformed yet still tethered to the grotesque origins that gave her life. She is not a saint, not a monster, not a simple heroine. She is something messier, freer, stranger. And perhaps that is why she lingers in my mind long after the credits rolled. She is the embodiment of contradictions, a reminder that human identity is never neat, never final, never fully containable. In her, I see the courage to live without apology, the defiance to embrace the grotesque, and the unsettling truth that freedom is always messy. When I think about what makes this film unforgettable, it is not only the story or the characters, but the cascade of strange details that seep into every corner of its world, the kind of details that make you sit back in your seat and wonder whether you are watching a dream or a joke that has grown too large to contain. These are not just trivia about the film's production or the novel it came from, but living textures woven into the story itself. Facts so bizarre that they blur into symbolism, each one revealing something about the strange humanity that pulses beneath the grotesque surface. I remember feeling, again and again, that I was not merely watching a film but stumbling through a hall of curiosities, each scene whispering a fact stranger than the last, and it is those moments that still haunt me when I try to describe the experience. The first fact that struck me was simply the premise itself, that a grown woman's body could house the brain of her unborn child. It sounds like a grotesque riddle, the sort of story one might find scribbled in the margins of a Victorian penny dreadful, and yet it is the cornerstone of the entire narrative. What unsettled me most is that the film does not treat this fact as absurd, but as perfectly real within its world. The science is never explained in rational terms, and yet it feels true because the story insists that it is. I found myself reflecting on how strange it is that we accept so many grotesque premises in art without question, and how those premises often reveal more about our culture than about science. This one, for instance, lays bare the tangled questions of identity, autonomy, and control in ways no realistic tale ever could. Another fact that lingers with me is the appearance of Dr. Godwin Baxter himself. His stitched and scarred face is never explained in detail, and the film never pauses to tell us how he came to look that way. Yet it is a fact that dominates every frame he appears in, a reminder that he is as much a creation as his experiments. The grotesque irony is that the creator is just as monstrous as the creation, and that fact destabilizes the easy boundaries between scientist and subject, father and child, master and servant. I kept thinking about how his body was a walking testament to the failures of control, the scars of hubris written on skin. That unspoken fact about him, that he, too, is stitched together in some way, changes the way we see everything he does. The film's world itself is a fact stranger than fiction, a distorted version of 19th century Europe that never truly existed but feels eerily familiar. The architecture bends and twists like something from a dream. The colors warp into garish pastels and shadows. The skies shift into impossible hues. It is not historical accuracy, but historical surrealism, a fact of aesthetic choice that unsettles because it shows us a past that never was yet feels truer to its spirit than any realistic depiction. I found myself wondering how strange it is that by exaggerating, by distorting, by bending reality into something grotesque, the film makes the hypocrisies and absurdities of that society even clearer. The fact that it looks unreal is what makes it feel honest. Bella's journey through brothels is another fact that disturbed me in its frankness. In most films, such spaces are veiled in shame, presented either as exploitative or as salacious. Here, they are playgrounds of discovery. The fact that Bella approaches them not with fear, but with curiosity, not with shame, but with appetite, unsettles everything we think we know about sexuality on screen. Watching her describe her encounters in blunt, almost childish terms, I realized that the strangest was not in her actions, but in how rarely we see female desire depicted without apology. That fact, that a woman can embrace pleasure as knowledge, still feels radical, still feels dangerous in the cinematic world, where female bodies are too often controlled by narrative morality. Then there is Duncan Wedderburn, a fact of masculinity so absurd that he becomes almost a parody of himself. His arrogance, his pomposity, his fragile ego, all of it is heightened to the point of grotesque comedy. The fact that he unravels so completely in the face of Bella's independence is both hilarious and tragic, a truth about male entitlement rendered in absurd extremes. I laughed at him, but I also shuddered, because the fact he embodies, that so many men collapse when confronted with women they cannot control, is not just a joke, but reality we all recognize. His strangeness is not in being unbelievable, but in being too believable, exaggerated just enough to expose the fragility of power. The politics woven into Bella's journey form another layer of strange fact, that she, a grotesque creation, becomes a voice for social justice, that her hunger for experience expands into a hunger for equality, is a fact that would seem absurd in any other story. Yet here, it feels inevitable, as though the strangeness of her existence gives her a vantage point from which to see society's hypocrisies more clearly. I remember being struck by how bizarre it was to hear radical political thought filtered through the mouth of a character who not long before was stumbling through language like a child. That juxtaposition is a fact of the narrative that forces us to see how quickly liberation can become contagious, how one person's defiance can ripple outward into political meaning. Even the visual design of the film is a cascade of strange facts. The pastel skies, the warped cityscapes, the interiors that look like painted backdrops, All of these are deliberate distortions, facts of style that refuse realism. They create a sense of living inside an illustration, a world where everything is slightly off, slightly grotesque. I kept marveling at how this choice, strange as it was, made the story feel even more alive, because it reminded me constantly that I was watching a fable, not a documentary. The fact of its artificiality is what gives it its truth. Bella's language, too, evolves in ways that feel almost uncanny. At first, she speaks in fragments, simple words, clumsy syntax. But as the story progresses, her speech becomes more fluid, more sophisticated, until by the end she speaks with eloquence and authority. This fact of linguistic evolution, compressed into the span of a single narrative, struck me as both surreal and revealing. It reminded me that language itself is a kind of liberation, a tool that allows us to shape thought, to command presence, to claim space. Watching her speech transform was like watching her very self coalesce, a fact of growth rendered in words rather than deeds. What fascinates me most, though, is that all of these strange facts, taken together, never feel like curiosities for their own sake. They are not eccentricities piled on to shock or amuse. They are the fabric of the story, each one revealing something essential about the nature of freedom, power, desire, and creation. The strangeness is the truth. The grotesque is the point. That realization still unsettles me, because it reminds me how much of life itself is strange, how much of our social order relies on denying that strangeness, smoothing it into categories that make us feel safe. This film refuses that safety, and in doing so, it forces us to confront the strangeness we live with every day. By the time I reach the end, I realize that the strangest fact of all is that I found beauty in it. Beauty in the grotesque, beauty in the unsettling, beauty in the contradictions that should repel, but instead draw us closer. That perhaps is the ultimate strangeness, that we could look at a story born of stitched flesh and absurd science, dripping with satire and grotesquerie, and find in it a mirror of ourselves. And that fact, literature-loving friends, is why I cannot stop thinking about this film long after the credits have faded into darkness. What has fascinated me most in the week since I first saw this film is how critics and audiences have struggled to describe it, how every review I read, every conversation I overheard, seemed to circle around the same feeling of astonishment and unease without quite landing on a single definition. The critical perspectives are as fractured and contradictory as the film itself, and in that contradiction lies a truth. This is not a story meant to be pinned down. I remember reading one critic who called it a feminist masterpiece, another who labeled it grotesque satire, and another who dismissed it as vulgar provocation, and I realized that each was right in some way and wrong in another. That is the gift of a work like this. It refuses consensus, forcing us to confront not only the film but our own assumptions about art, morality, and freedom. One of the most prominent perspectives has been to read the film through the lens of feminist liberation. Bella, after all, embodies a kind of raw female agency that unsettles patriarchal structures wherever she goes. Critics have celebrated her refusal of shame, her embrace of pleasure, her rejection of male control. They point to her journey as a radical reimagining of what it means to come of age as a woman, not in the shadow of morality tales, but in the glare of unapologetic appetite. I found myself nodding at these readings, because there is no doubt that the film revels in Bella's defiance. Yet at the same time, I felt that calling it a feminist parable alone was too neat, too comfortable. The story is messier than that, because Bella's liberation is not purely triumphant, but fraught with contradictions, dangers, and cruelties of her own. To flatten her into a symbol is to miss the jagged edges that make her so unsettling. Another strand of criticism has framed the film as satire, a grotesque parody of 19th century society and its hypocrisies. In this view, every character is an exaggeration. Baxter as a hubristic scientist, Duncan as a fragile libertine, Bella as the unruly disruption of norms. The world itself, with its warped landscapes and garish colors, becomes a caricature of Victorian excess. I found this perspective illuminating, because it explained why I often felt I was watching a political cartoon come to life, a theater of absurdity where every gesture was both ridiculous and revealing. Yet even here, I resisted the neatness of the label. Satire alone does not account for the deep tenderness that occasionally flickers through, the moment of vulnerability that resists mockery. Some critics, especially those less charmed by the film's excesses, have dismissed it as grotesque provocation, a work designed to shock rather than to illuminate. They point to the sexual frankness, the absurd premise, the surreal visuals, and argue that the film mistakes vulgarity for depth. I understand this discomfort, because there were moments when I too felt pushed to my limits, when the laughter turned sour and the grotesque spectacle seemed overwhelming. Yet I could never dismiss it, because behind every provocation was a question that lingered. Why are we shocked by female pleasure? Why are we unsettled by grotesque bodies? Why do we recoil from freedom when it refuses to be polite? The provocation, I realize, is the point. It forces us to ask why we feel provoked. What intrigued me most was how audiences themselves became part of the event. I remember sitting in a theater where laughter and gasps overlapped, where people whispered in disbelief, where silence fell heavy in moments of discomfort. Watching the audience respond was like watching another performance layered on top of the film. Some laughed with delight at Bella's blunt descriptions of sex. Others squirmed in embarrassment. Some applauded her defiance. Others shifted uneasily in their seats. That collective unease became part of the meaning, a reminder that art is never experienced alone, but always in dialogue with those around us. The event of watching this film was itself a kind of grotesque carnival, where strangers were bound together in discomfort and fascination. The film also became a cultural event far beyond the theater, sparking debates online and in print about its meaning and value. I saw essays comparing it to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, to Angela Carter's feminist fables, to the absurdism of Kafka. Others debated whether its frankness was liberating or exploitative, whether Bella's agency was genuine or simply another layer of objectification. These debates fascinated me because they revealed how art can fracture communities, drawing out fault lines of belief and ideology. I found myself less interested in who was right and more interested in the fact that the film demanded argument, that it refused to let anyone remain neutral. That is rare in cinema today, where so much is consumed and forgotten. This was a work that lingered, provoked, demanded attention. One of the most insightful critiques I encountered argued that the film is less about feminism or satire than about freedom itself. Freedom in its rawest, most unsettling form. Bella embodies freedom without apology, without restraint, without the safety nets of morality or convention. This perspective helped me articulate why the film unsettled me so deeply. Because freedom is terrifying. To see someone live without shame, without fear, without compromise, is both exhilarating and destabilizing. It forces us to confront the ways in which we are not free, the compromises we accept, the hypocrisies we live with. Bella's grotesque freedom is a mirror that reveals our own chains. At the same time, I cannot forget the critiques that challenge me to see the dangers in Bella's liberation. Some pointed out that her journey risks romanticizing recklessness, that her embrace of pleasure can be destructive not only to herself, but to those around her. Others questioned whether the film's male creators could truly capture the authenticity of female desire, or whether Bella was ultimately another male fantasy dressed in feminist clothes. These critiques made me pause, because they reminded me that no work of art is above suspicion, that every narrative is shaped by the power structures of its creation. The fact that I love Bella's defiance did not absolve the film of its own contradictions. The events surrounding the film's release also shaped its critical reception. It premiered at major festivals where it quickly became the talk of critics, praised for its boldness but also dissected for its provocations. The performances, particularly Emma Stone's, were singled out as daring and transformative, a commitment to grotesque embodiment rarely seen in mainstream cinema. Awards buzz grew, but so did backlash, with some audiences rejecting its vulgarity outright. Watching this cultural wave unfold, I realized that the film itself was becoming a kind of Bella, loved and hated, celebrated and condemned, unsettling wherever it went. It was not just a film but an event, a disruption of the cinematic landscape, forcing critics and audiences alike to wrestle with its contradictions. For me, the most compelling perspective is to see the film not as one thing but as a collision of many: satire, feminist fable, grotesque provocation, surreal allegory. It is all of these and none of them, always slipping away from definition. And perhaps that is its greatest achievement, that it resists the comfort of labels and instead confronts us with questions. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to create? What does it mean to laugh at what should horrify us? to desire what should shame us, to live without apology in a world built on apology. These are not questions that critics can answer definitively. They are questions that linger, that haunt, that provoke us long after the reviews are written and the debates die down. In the end, the critical perspectives and cultural events surrounding this film mirror the film itself. Chaotic, contradictory, grotesque, unsettling. And that, literature-loving friends, is why I find it so powerful. Because it does not give us answers, but forces us into dialogue, not only with the work, but with one another, with our own discomfort, with the society we inhabit. It is a work that insists on being lived with, wrestled with, argued over. And in that insistence, it becomes more than a film. It becomes an event in our lives, one that we carry with us, one that reshapes how we see not only cinema, but ourselves. When I think about how this film came into being, I am struck by how every layer of its production feels as strange and daring as the story itself, as though the act of making it required the same willingness to defy rules, embrace contradictions, and push limits. Watching it on screen, I kept marveling at how impossible it seemed, how unlikely it was that such a grotesque, unclassifiable work could have been shepherded through the machinery of modern filmmaking. And yet the fact that it exists at all is itself a kind of miracle, a testament to creative vision and risk that deserves to be savored as much as the film's narrative. The journey began with Alasdair Gray's novel, itself a strange piece of literature, a Scottish tale of grotesque rebirth and satirical bite. To adapt such a work was already a risk, because its style is eccentric, filled with illustrations, metafictional tricks, and radical politics. Many would have called it unfilmable. But Yorgos Lanthimos, with his reputation for blending absurdity, cruelty, and humor in films like The Favour and The Lobster, saw in an opportunity to create something unique. I remember reading about how he had carried the idea for years, waiting for the right moment, and how Emma Stone herself became part of the project, not just as actor, but as collaborator, shaping Bella's journey with a devotion that went beyond performance. This origin itself fascinated me, because it showed that the grotesque brilliance of the film was not accidental, but born of long gestation, of creative minds daring to wrestle with difficult material. The production design, one of the film's most striking achievements, was a world unto itself. The decision to abandon realism and instead build distorted, pastel-hued, dreamlike environments was a bold gamble. Sets were crafted with meticulous care to look like paintings brought to life, with exaggerated perspectives, warped horizons, and colors that oscillated between garish and beautiful. I found myself staring at the screen in disbelief, wondering how they had achieved such an effect. It turned out that much of it was practical, not digital, with massive sets constructed to create the sense of living in an illustration. That fact still astonishes me, because in a world dominated by computer effects, this film leaned on craftsmanship, on painted backdrops and intricate models, to create a world that felt tactile and unreal at once. Costume design, too, became a kind of storytelling. Bella's clothing evolves with her journey, moving from childlike dresses to bold, extravagant garments that reflect her growing confidence. Each stitch seemed to carry meaning, each fabric a layer of symbolism. The production team spoke about how the costumes were deliberately exaggerated, echoing Victorian fashion, but twisting it into something surreal, with colors and shapes that defied historical accuracy. Watching her parade through Lisbon in garish gowns, I realized how much the costumes themselves were characters, reflecting not just her growth but the absurdity of society around her. Cinematography played its role in heightening the strangeness. Robbie Ryan's work behind the camera embraced fisheye lenses, distorted perspectives, and long tracking shots that made the world feel both expansive and claustrophobic. I remember being disoriented at times, my sense of space collapsing as the camera bent walls and skies into impossible curves. This was not a mistake, but a deliberate choice, a way of placing us inside Bella's distorted perception of the world. Where nothing is fixed, everything is malleable. I later learned that Ryan and Lanthimos tested dozens of lenses to find the right ones, and that they embrace imperfection, allowing shadows, blurs, and odd flares to remain. That fact struck me as poetic. In a story about grotesque creation, the very images themselves carry the marks of imperfection, as though the film were stitched together visually in the same way Bella was stitched together biologically. Then there is the sound design, often overlooked but essential. The world of film hums with strange noises, footsteps that echo too loudly, silences that stretch too long, laughter that cuts through scenes like glass. The music, composed by Jerrod Fendrix, was equally strange, filled with instruments bent out of shape, sounds that seemed almost biological, as though the score itself were alive and mutating. I remember the discomfort of hearing notes that felt half familiar and half alien, and realizing that the soundscape itself was part of the grotesque. That choice fascinated me, because it turned music into another layer of storytelling, reinforcing the sense that everything in this world was distorted, alive, unsettling. Emma Stone's performance has become the centerpiece of production lore. Stories from the set describe how she threw herself into Bella with fearless abandon, embracing not only the nudity and frankness, but the awkwardness, the tantrums, the grotesque humor. What astonishes me is that she was not simply delivering lines, but helping shape Bella's evolution, working with Lanthimos to decide how her speech would change, how her movements would shift from childlike to confident. I think of the strange fact that she performed scenes with deliberate awkwardness, stumbling and flailing, only to gradually refine them, charting Bella's growth not just through dialogue but through body language. That level of commitment explains why the performance feels so alive, so unfiltered, so unsettling. Other cast members added their own strangeness to production. Willem Dafoe as Baxter endured hours of prosthetic makeup to create his scarred visage, and he spoke about how liberating it was to let that grotesque mask inform his performance. Mark Ruffalo as Duncan leaned into caricature, crafting a performance so exaggerated that it teetered on the edge of farce, yet carried the fragile core of a man undone by his own arrogance. I found it fascinating how each actor seemed to embrace the grotesque as a gift rather than a burden, using it to push their performances beyond realism into something theatrical and uncanny. Fun facts about the shoot itself abound. Many of the outdoor scenes, though they looked like vast cities, were filmed on constructed sets with painted skies, creating a theatrical artificiality. Crew members described how surreal it was to walk into a soundstage and feel as though they had stepped into a giant dollhouse, a pastel nightmare that looked beautiful on camera but disorienting in person. I love imagining that because it mirrors the audience's experience, living inside a world that is gorgeous and grotesque at once. Another curious detail is that the film avoided modern digital tricks wherever possible, relying instead on practical effects, mirrors, and forced perspectives. That old-fashioned craftsmanship gave it a timeless quality, making it feel both modern and antique, a hybrid of past and present. Even the editing process carried strangeness. Lanthimos is known for lingering on awkward silences, for cutting in ways that disrupt comfort, and this film amplifies that style. Scenes stretch longer than expected. Conversations end abruptly. Laughter is held too long. These editing choices create unease, a rhythm that feels unnatural, forcing the viewer to sit with discomfort. I think about how strange it is that something as invisible as editing can shape emotions so powerfully, turning moments of humor into moments of horror and vice versa. The film's production history is also dotted with festival lore, the kind of facts that make it feel like an event even before it reached wide audiences. At its Venice premiere, it reportedly earned a long-standing ovation, with critics divided between awe and discomfort. Emma Stone was praised for her bravery, Lanthimos for his vision, but there were also walkouts, people unwilling to accept its provocations. I find this detail fascinating, because it shows how art can divide even in the moment of celebration, how the event of screening itself becomes part of the narrative. The film's journey through award season added more layers, as it collected prizes, but also sparked debates about taste, decency, and the boundaries of art. For me, the most delightful fun fact is how much joy the cast and crew seem to find in creating something so grotesque. Interviews reveal laughter on set, a sense of play, a recognition that the absurdity was part of the fun. I love imagining that behind the camera, amid the prosthetics and distorted sets, there was laughter, camaraderie, the shared thrill of making something daring. That fact matters because it reminds us that even the strangest, most unsettling works are born of human joy, of collaboration, of people daring to create together. Looking back, I realize the production of this film is itself a mirror of its story, a strange experiment, stitched together from bold choices, grotesque risks, and defiant creativity. The fact that it emerged coherent, beautiful, and unsettling is a testament to the power of art to embrace strangeness and transform it into meaning. And perhaps that is the greatest fun fact of all, that what seemed unfilmable, impossible, even absurd, became not only a film but a work that will be remembered, argued over, and cherished for years to come. The setting of this film is perhaps its most immediately disorienting element, a world that looks both familiar and utterly alien, like a dream of the 19th century painted by a fevered imagination. I remember the first time the camera opened onto the distorted streets and pastel skies. I felt as though I had stepped into a theater rather than a film, as though the very air of the story was artificial, deliberately crafted to unsettle my sense of place. This is not the Europe of history books, nor the Victorian world of costume dramas, but a warped and exaggerated reflection of it, and that distortion becomes as important to the narrative as any character. What makes the setting remarkable is how it refuses realism. Buildings curve at impossible angles, skies glow with colors that never existed in nature, interiors stretch and shrink like illusions on a stage. Walking through these spaces, Bella feels at once larger than life and completely dwarfed by the world's strangeness, a mirror of her own contradictions. For me, watching those landscapes was like wandering through a painting that had been allowed to mutate, as though the brushstrokes had melted and warped into grotesque shapes. It reminded me of the marginalia of medieval manuscripts, where strange creatures lurk in bright colors, unsettling the supposed seriousness of the main text. The setting here does the same. It undermines the solemnity of the Victorian age, exposing its absurdity by exaggerating it. The cinematography amplifies this sense of unreality. Robbie Ryan's camera embraces distortion through fisheye lenses, bending space so that hallways seem endless and rooms curve like bubbles. The effect is to place us inside Bella's perspective, seeing the world not as fixed but as fluid, constantly shifting. I remember the unsettling sensation of watching a ballroom scene with the walls bent inward, making the grandeur claustrophobic, as though the space itself wanted to contain her even as she defied containment. These visual distortions are not gimmicks but arguments, cinematic statements that say, the world itself is grotesque, the setting itself is complicit in controlling bodies. Color is another element that seizes attention. The palette is deliberately artificial. Pastels so bright they feel sickly, contrasts so sharp they unsettle rather than soothe. Skies of turquoise, interiors of mustard yellow, costumes of garish pink, all combine to create a world that looks edible and poisonous at once. I found myself both delighted and repelled, because the colors seduce the eye while simultaneously warning of danger. This paradox in color mirrors Bella's own contradictions: pleasure and peril, beauty and grotesque, innocence and danger. The setting becomes not just backdrop but metaphor, as though every hue whispers something about her journey. Sound design deepens the surreal setting. Streets hum with noises that are too loud or too quiet. Interiors echo unnaturally. Laughter rings with an edge of cruelty. The score itself, with its mutated instruments and distorted tones, blends with the ambient sound to create a world where nothing feels stable. I remember moments of silence stretched so long that they became oppressive, only to be shattered by sudden bursts of grotesque music. That rhythm of sound mirrored the rhythm of the setting, unpredictable and unsettling, reinforcing the sense that this was not a stable world, but one in constant flux. Lighting, too, is used not to imitate naturalism but to heighten artifice. Shadows stretch unnaturally, highlights gleam too brightly. Faces are sometimes lit like portraits rather than real bodies. This theatrical lighting makes every scene feel staged, reminding us that we are watching not reality, but a constructed fable. Yet, paradoxically, this artificiality makes the emotions feel more real, as though stripping away realism allows us to confront truth more directly. I found myself thinking of German expressionist cinema, with its distorted sets and dramatic shadows, and how those choices revealed inner psychology more vividly than realism ever could. Poor Things carries that tradition into the 21st century, using setting not to reproduce life, but to expose its absurdities. What fascinates me most is how the setting interacts with Bella's growth. At the beginning, the house of Baxter feels like a grotesque nursery, distorted yet contained, a space where a chaotic rebirth can unfold in relative safety. When she leaves with Duncan, the world opens into pastel cities, decadent brothels, opulent interiors, all exaggerated, all absurd. These settings reflect her appetite, her hunger for pleasure and knowledge, her exploration of society's contradictions. Later, as she confronts political realities, the settings become harsher, more oppressive, revealing the cruelty beneath the garish surfaces. In each stage, the world mirrors her evolution, shifting as she shifts, reminding us that setting in this film is not passive but alive, growing and distorting alongside its heroine. Even the smallest cinematic elements contribute to this sense of grotesque fable. Camera angles often tilt slightly, making ordinary scenes feel askew. Edits linger too long, stretching time into discomfort. Background extras behave in subtly exaggerated ways, their movements too stiff or too strange, reminding us that society itself is part of performance. Every detail conspires to make the viewer unsettled, to remind us that this is not a natural world, but a constructed one, and in that construction lies its truth. I cannot forget the sense of scale the film created through its sets. Though many scenes looked vast, they were filmed on constructed stages with painted backdrops, theatrical in their artifice. This choice fascinated me, because it made the world feel both infinite and claustrophobic, a paradox that mirrors Bella's own freedom and confinement. She can travel across continents, yet every space she enters feels distorted, as though society itself is a cage disguised as a playground. That fact about the setting still lingers with me, because it reveals how environments shape freedom, how space itself can become a character in the story of liberation. By the end of the film, I realized that the setting had become inseparable from the narrative, that its grotesque distortions were not decoration, but argument. The warped buildings, garish colors, distorted sounds, all was telling me that the world is not stable, that society is not natural, that the structures we live within are as artificial as painted backdrops. Bella's defiance becomes all the more powerful in this context, because she refuses to accept the world as given. She moves through distorted settings with her own distorted self, and in that collision, the film finds its strange beauty. For me, the cinematic elements of this film are a reminder of why I love cinema as an art form. Only in film can space bend, colors scream, sound distort, and yet all of it remain believable because the camera insists that it is real. Poor Things shows us not the world as it is, but the world as grotesque metaphor, and in doing so it gives us a deeper truth about freedom, power, and desire. That is the gift of its setting and its cinematic language. They dare to be strange, and in that strangeness, they reveal more than realism ever could. What stays with me just as much as the story on screen is the story of how it was made, because there is something fascinating about peering behind the curtain of a film that feels this surreal. When I think of behind-the-scenes insights, I don't just think of anecdotes in the set, but the atmosphere in which the work came to life. The strange collaboration between director, actors, designers, and technicians who dared to lean fully into a vision that many would have dismissed as too grotesque or unmarketable. To imagine them all working together in that pastel-warped world fills me with awe, because it makes clear that what we saw on screen was the product of trust, of risk, and of shared daring. Yorgos Lanthimos has always struck me as a director unafraid of discomfort, and his process here seems to have been no different. He is known for encouraging his actors to strip away polish, to embrace awkwardness, to inhabit silences, and stumbles rather than hiding them. On this set, that method deepened into something more radical. Stories from production suggest that rehearsals felt almost like theater workshops, with the cast exploring movement, experimenting with exaggerated gestures, and learning to unlearn naturalism. I find this compelling, because it explains why the performances feel so strange yet so alive. The actors were not merely following instructions, but immersing themselves in a new language of movement and speech. Emma Stone's commitment to Bella was especially remarkable. Behind the scenes, she was not only the star, but also a collaborator, shaping choices about how Bella would evolve linguistically and physically. I read that she and Lanthimos worked closely to map out how her speech would gradually shift from fractured childlike fragments to sophisticated eloquence, and how her body language would transform from stumbling awkwardness to commanding poise. To hear that these details were meticulously rehearsed makes me appreciate even more the apparent spontaneity of her performance. It reminds me that what looks chaotic on screen is often the product of careful planning, that the grotesque is choreographed with as much precision as any ballet. Willem Dafoe, too, seems to have embraced the behind-the-scenes challenge with characteristic dedication. His grotesque visage was achieved through hours of prosthetic makeup, and yet he treated it not as a burden, but as a gift, letting the mask inform how he moved and spoke. He once said that wearing such prosthetics liberated him, because it stripped away vanity and allowed him to disappear into the grotesque. I find that fascinating because it suggests that behind the scenes, the very tools of transformation, the prosthetics, the costumes, the sets, were not just cosmetic but creative collaborators, shaping performance as much as the actors themselves. Mark Ruffalo's portrayal of Duncan became another story in itself. He approached the role with a willingness to be foolish, to risk humiliation, to exaggerate himself into caricature. Behind the scenes, he reportedly played with his delivery, testing different levels of absurdity until he and Lanthimos settled on a tone that was both comically grotesque and tragically revealing. I admire that willingness to risk, because it shows how even an established actor had to strip away dignity to serve the film's vision. That choice reminds me that behind every grotesque laugh the film elicits, there was an actor bravely pushing himself into discomfort. The production team itself created a behind-the-scenes world as surreal as the one on screen. The sets, built on sound stages, were so warped and pastel that crew members described them as disorienting to walk through. Painted skies loomed overhead, forcing perspectives made hallways curve unnaturally, and whole cityscapes were constructed like theatrical illusions. I imagine the crew entering these spaces each day must have felt like stepping into another reality, living inside the very fable they were helping to create. The artificiality was so complete that even off-camera, it blurred the line between real and unreal, work and performance. One of my favorite behind-the-scenes details is how much of the visual strangeness was achieved practically rather than digitally. Forced perspective sets, unusual lenses, painted backdrops. These old techniques were resurrected and adapted to modern filmmaking. That decision fascinates me because it required enormous effort and creativity, but gave the film its tactile, dreamlike quality. Behind the scenes, carpenters, painters, and set designers became as important as actors, their craftsmanship infusing every frame with physical presence. It reminds me that cinema is always a collective art, and that the strangest we see on screen is the result of hundreds of hands shaping wood, fabric, paint, and light. Even the costumes carry behind-the-scenes stories. Designers worked not just to reproduce Victorian fashion, but to exaggerate it, bending silhouettes and colors until they became surreal. Emma Stone has spoken about how wearing Bella's extravagant gowns changed the way she moved, how the weight and shape of the clothing forced her into postures that informed her performance. I love that detail, because it shows how costume is never mere decoration, but a tool of embodiment, shaping character from the outside in. Sound was another layer of behind-the-scenes invention. The composer, Jerskin Fendrix, created a score out of sounds that often bordered on grotesque, mutated instruments, strange pitches, notes that sounded almost organic. Behind the scenes, musicians experimented with unconventional techniques, bending strings, distorting tones, inventing sound that felt alive. To imagine a recording studio filled with such bizarre noises makes me smile, because it mirrors the surreal world of the film itself. That process fascinates me because it reveals how strangeness was cultivated at every stage, from performance to design to sound. Perhaps the most delightful behind-the-scenes insight is the atmosphere play that permeated the set. Despite the grotesque subject matter, accounts suggest that laughter was frequent, that the cast and crew found joy in the absurdity. Emma Stone has described how scenes of nudity and awkwardness were handled with respect and humor, creating a space where vulnerability became bearable. Mark Ruffalo spoke about laughing at his own foolishness, embracing the silliness of Duncan even when it felt humiliating. To hear these stories is to realize that behind the unsettling spectacle was a community of artists supporting one another, finding courage through camaraderie. When I step back and reflect, I see that the behind-the-scenes story mirrors the narrative of the film itself. Just as Bella is a creation stitched together out of grotesque contradictions, the film was a creation stitched together by dozens of collaborators, each contributing their own eccentric piece. Just as the story revels in artifice, the production embraced artificiality in sets, costumes, and sound. Just as Bella's liberation required risk, the making of the film required artists willing to risk failure, ridicule, and discomfort. In this way, the process and the product become inseparable, two reflections of the same truth. That beauty can emerge from grotesque collaboration, that meaning can arise from strangeness, that art is always a child of risk. When I let this film settle in my memory, I realize that what truly lingers are not just the grotesque images or unsettling characters, but the themes that pulse beneath them, the layers of symbolism that turn every moment into more than itself. Watching felt like walking through an allegorical dream where every gesture, every color, every distortion whispered a meaning beyond the surface. And yet, what fascinated me was how the film resisted simple interpretation. The themes do not arrive neatly labeled but bleed into one another, contradictory, messy, alive. Just as Bella herself is contradictory, messy, alive. That refusal to be tidy is part of the brilliance, because it forces us to live with the questions rather than retreat into easy answers. At its core, the film is a meditation on freedom. Bella embodies a kind of raw, unapologetic liberation that unsettles everyone around her. Her refusal of shame, her embrace of pleasure, her rejection of social constraints. All of these form the backbone of her story. Yet the theme of freedom here is not triumphant in a straightforward way. It is messy, dangerous, often cruel. Bella's freedom comes at the cost of relationships. It provokes ridicule and punishment. It exposes the hypocrisies of society, but also her own capacity for recklessness. Watching her, I realized that the film was asking me to reconsider what freedom really means. Is it the ability to do whatever one desires? Or is it the courage to live without apology despite consequences? In Bella's journey, freedom is not sanitized or heroic. It is grotesque, and in its grotesqueness it feels more true than any idealized vision. Another theme that struck me deeply was creation and control. Bella is the product of Dr. Baxter's grotesque experiment, a body stitched together with a child's brain, and yet she refuses to be his creation in the way he intends. This conflict becomes a symbol of all acts of creation, artistic or scientific. Once something is created, be it a life, a work of art, or a social system, it slips from the creator's control and takes on a life of its own. Bella's defiance is a rebuke to every creator who believes they can dictate meaning or destiny. That symbolism resonates beyond the narrative because it reflects a relationship between artist and audience, between parent and child, between society and individual. To create is to release, and to release is to accept loss of control. The grotesque body itself becomes a powerful symbol throughout the film. From Baxter's scarred visage to Bella's awkward physicality, the distorted body stands as a reminder that beauty and ugliness are not opposites but intertwined. The body here is not polished or idealized but exaggerated, imperfect, strange. This symbolism unsettled me because it forced me to confront my own assumptions about what body should be. Bella's sexuality, expressed through a body that should by all logic be grotesque, becomes a challenge to the notion that only perfect bodies are worthy of desire or freedom. The film insists that the grotesque body is still human, still beautiful, still capable of joy and love. That message, delivered through unsettling imagery, carries a radical charge. Sexuality itself is laden with symbolic weight. Bella's unapologetic appetite becomes not just a personal trait, but a symbol of liberation from the hypocrisies of patriarchal society. She refuses shame. She embraces pleasure. She speaks of sex with blunt honesty. That refusal becomes a weapon against the structures that seek to contain her. Yet the film complicates this theme by refusing to romanticize sexuality as purely liberating. Bella's journey shows that sex can be joyful but also exploitative, liberating but also dangerous. The symbolism here is complex. Sexuality is neither savior nor curse, but a terrain of struggle, a mirror of power, a language of defiance. The film's distorted setting and garish colors add another layer of symbolism. The warped architecture and pastel hues reflect not historical accuracy, but the absurdity of social structures. They remind us that society itself is a construction, as artificial and grotesque as the painted backdrops of the film. This symbolism deepens a thematic critique. Just as Bella refuses to accept the world as given, the film refuses to depict the world as natural. It shows us instead that everything, gender roles, class hierarchies, moral codes, is constructed, fragile, absurd. By exaggerating reality into grotesque parody, the film exposes the artifice of the systems we live within. Violence, too, pulses as a symbolic undercurrent. The grotesque rebirth of Bella is an act of violence disguised as science, and throughout the film, acts of violence haunt her freedom. Yet what struck me is that the violence is never glorified. It is shown as grotesque, absurd, sometimes comic, sometimes tragic. Violence becomes a symbol of the fragility of social order, of how quickly power resorts to brutality when confronted with defiance. Bella's survival in the face of violence becomes another layer of her liberation. She is not free because violence does not exist, but free because she refuses to let it define her. The evolution of Bella's language carries symbolic resonance as well. Her journey from broken fragments of speech to eloquent discourse symbolizes not only personal growth, but the power of language itself. To speak is to claim space, to articulate selfhood, to shape reality. Watching her language develop, I realized that her freedom was not only physical or sexual, but intellectual, rooted in the ability to think and communicate with clarity. The symbolism here is profound. Language is liberation, and a denial of language is a denial of self. Bella's growth into speech mirrors the growth of every oppressed voice learning to claim its narrative. Even humor becomes symbolic. The grotesque laughter that threads through the film unsettles because it forces us to laugh at what should horrify us. That laughter is not mere entertainment. It is a symbol of complicity. When we laugh at Bella's tantrums or Duncan's absurdity, we become part of the grotesque carnival, implicated in the hypocrisies being mocked. Humor here symbolizes a collapse of moral certainty, the recognition that we are all part of the absurdity. I remember laughing and then wincing, realizing that my laughter was itself symbolic of the discomfort the film wanted me to face. Perhaps the deepest theme of all is contradiction. Every element of the film is contradictory. Bella is both child and woman, innocent and experienced, grotesque and beautiful. The world is both garish and oppressive, society both absurd and terrifying. These contradictions are not mistakes but deliberate themes, symbols of the complexity of human life. To live, the film suggests, is to embrace contradiction, to accept that freedom is messy, identity fractured, desire both liberating and dangerous. This thematic embrace of contradiction is what makes the film feel so alive, because it mirrors the contradictions we all live with but rarely acknowledge. By the time the credits rolled, I realized that the themes and symbolism of this film were not answers but provocations. They did not tell me what to think, but forced me to question what I believed. What is freedom? What is beauty? What is creation? What is shame? The film offers no final word, only grotesque images and contradictions that linger in the mind. And perhaps that is its greatest gift. To remind us that meaning is not given but made, that symbolism is not fixed but fluid, that themes are not conclusions but invitations to reflection. When I look back on this film with a mind not only for its story but for how it was made, I realize that so much of its impact comes from the precise choices of filmmaking technique. Choices that seem strange at first glance, but together weave the grotesque tapestry that lingers in memory. To watch it is to feel the hand of craft in every frame, and the more I learn about how those frames were built, the more I marvel at the risks taken, the boldness embraced, and the technical ingenuity that turned what might have been a chaotic mess into a coherent and unsettling masterpiece. One of the most striking techniques is the use of lenses that distort perspective. Ryan's cinematography bends space into strange shapes, using fisheye and wide-angle lenses that make rooms curve and faces warp. This choice unsettled me from the first moment, because it refused the comfort of normal perspective, reminding me that I was not seeing reality, but a warped reflection of it. At times, the distortion made spaces feel claustrophobic, even when they were grand, and at other times it stretched small rooms into vast arenas of absurdity. I found myself leaning back in my seat, disoriented, as though the world itself were alive and complicit in Bella's journey. That technical choice was not gimmick, but philosophy. Reality is not stable, and cinema should not pretend otherwise. The editing rhythm contributes its own strangeness. Lanthimos and his editor chose to linger on moments most films would cut away from, holding silences until they became uncomfortable, letting laughter echo too long, stretching pauses into tension. This technique forced me as a viewer to sit with discomfort, to live in the grotesque spaces between words. At the same time, sudden cuts would jolt me out of rhythm, leaving me off balance. That uneven cadence reminded me that life itself is not smoothly edited but jagged, filled with awkwardness and rupture. The film dares to make us feel that rupture formally, embedding its themes in the cut as much as in the dialogue. Sound design is another layer of technique that fascinated me. Jerrod Fendrick's score is filled with instruments bent out of shape, sounds that seem half human, half mechanical. Behind it, The ambient sound exaggerates reality. Footsteps echo louder than expected. Silence falls heavier than normal. Voices reverberate in grotesque ways. I remember moments where sound itself became a character, pressing it on Bella, unsettling me in my seat. This technique makes the world feel unstable, not through image alone but through vibration, reminding us that grotesque reality is felt as much as seen. Lighting carries symbolic weight through its theatricality. Instead of striving for naturalism, scenes glow with exaggerated highlights and shadows, faces lit as though they were paintings rather than people. This stylization unsettled me because it stripped away realism, but in doing so it revealed inner psychology more vividly. Bella's early scenes are often bathed in harsh, uneven light, her awkwardness heightened by illumination that refuses to flatter. Later, as she grows into confidence, the lighting shifts into something more composed yet still unreal, reminding us that even liberation occurs within an artificial society. It is a reminder that filmmaking is always artifice, and here the artifice is embraced to reveal rather than conceal truth. Costume and set design, though often spoken of in terms of aesthetics, are themselves filmmaking techniques, shaping performance and narrative. Bella's gowns, exaggerated and surreal, forced Emma Stone into specific movements, and those movements became part of the character. The pastel cityscapes, hand-painted skies, and forced perspectives shaped how the camera could move, dictating cinematic language. In this way, design and technique blur together, each feeding the other. What fascinated me was how much of this was achieved practically, through painted backdrops, constructed sets, and crafted garments rather than digital trickery. That choice gives the film a tactile quality, a weight that makes even the most surreal images feel grounded. Even humor becomes technique. The timing of grotesque jokes, the framing of Duncan's absurd flailing, the sudden cut from laughter to violence. These moments are crafted with precision, reminding me that comedy is as technical as drama. The fact that I laughed and then felt uncomfortable is not accident, but design, a manipulation of timing, framing, and rhythm that demonstrates the film's mastery of craft. As I reflect on these techniques, I realize that they all serve one purpose: to refuse realism in order to reveal truth. Where other films strive to hide the hand of the filmmaker, this one insists on showing it, bending perspective, distorting sound, exaggerating design. The technique becomes part of the story, a reminder that the world we live in is itself constructed, artificial, grotesque. And then there's a question of box office, a reminder that even the most daring art exists within the machinery of commerce. When the film premiered at festivals, it quickly became a subject of fascination, praise for its boldness, question for its vulgarity. That festival buzz translated into awards attention, with Emma Stone's performance singled out repeatedly as fearless, transformative, unforgettable. Such acclaim built anticipation, and when the film moved into wider release, it became a cultural event as much as a cinematic one. Box office numbers for a film this strange are always precarious, because it does not promise the comfort of genre or the safety of conventional storytelling. Yet, what amazed me was how audiences showed up curious, drawn by word of mouth and critical discourse. In markets like Europe and North America, it performed above expectations, proving that there's hunger for cinema that dares to provoke. Awards nominations further boosted its visibility, keeping it in theaters longer, allowing it to cross over from art house darling to broader conversation. I remember following reports of its earnings and marveling that a work so grotesque, so unflinching, could carve a place in a marketplace dominated by blockbusters. It did not break records, but it did something perhaps more impressive. It made profit while maintaining its uncompromising vision. That fact, to me, is as remarkable as any technical achievement. It shows that audiences are willing to engage with strangeness, that cinema still has room for works that unsettle rather than soothe. In the end, the filmmaking techniques and the box office performance are two sides of the same truth. The techniques reveal a vision unafraid of artifice, distortion, and provocation. The box office reveals that such a vision, though risky, can find resonance, can draw viewers into its grotesque carnival. Together, they remind me that cinema is both art and commerce, dream and business, grotesque experiment and marketable product. That contradiction, like Bella herself, is unsettling and yet liberating. When I turn my thoughts toward the cast of this film, I realized that so much of its power comes not only from the grotesque vision of its director, but from the flesh and blood commitment of the performers who embodied it. Watching them on screen, I often wondered what it must have taken behind the scenes to inhabit such strange roles, to surrender dignity for grotesque honesty, to let go of safety and step fully into the carnival of contradictions. Later, when I read and listened to their interviews, I found myself even more moved, because their words revealed not just professionalism but a deep recognition of what they were part of, an experiment in cinema as daring as the one Baxter conducts in science. Emma Stone, at the center of it all, gave a performance that critics have rightly described as fearless. On screen, she is chaotic, awkward, voracious, tender, grotesque, beautiful, all at once. But hearing her speak about the role, I was struck by how much thought and labor underpinned that apparent chaos. She described working with Lanthimos to chart Bella's evolution, rehearsing not only speech but movement, shaping a physical journey from stumbling tantrums to poised command. She spoke of Bella not as a character she performed, but as a being she discovered, step by step, through awkwardness and appetite. I remember reading one interview where she said that playing Bella required her to strip away every instinct to be polished or likable, to embrace the embarrassing, the silly, the raw. That honesty resonated with me, because it explained why her performance feels so alive. She was not protecting herself, but offered herself fully to the grotesque. Willem Dafoe, as Dr. Baxter, brought his own strange dedication, covered in prosthetics that scarred his face into a grotesque mask. He described how liberating it was to disappear behind that artifice. In interviews, he spoke about how the makeup freed him from vanity, letting him embrace a character who was both grotesque and tragic. I found his perspective fascinating because it echoed the film's own themes, that the grotesque can be freeing, that imperfection can be liberating. His willingness to embody such a scarred figure reminded me that acting at its best is not about looking good, but about revealing truth, however unsettling. Mark Ruffalo surprised many audiences with his exaggerated, almost clownish turn as Duncan Wedderburn, known for his more restrained and sensitive roles. Here he embraced farce, strutting and flailing, making himself ridiculous. He later admitted in interviews that it was one of the most freeing experiences of his career, because it allowed him to risk humiliation, to push past the boundaries of realism into grotesque comedy. Hearing him speak about how much fun he had made me smile, because it reminded me that behind the discomfort we felt in the theater was an actor delighting in absurdity, reveling in the chance to play. His willingness to be ridiculous turned Duncan into more than parody. It made him a tragicomic warning about fragility and entitlement. Even Ramy Youssef, as Max McCandles, contributed a quiet strangeness. His interviews revealed a deep affection for his character's timidity, a recognition of how desire can be both tender and suffocating. He spoke about wanting to play Max with sincerity rather than mockery, to show how even gentleness can be complicit in objectification. That perspective gave me a new appreciation for his performance, because it revealed how much care he took to make Max more than a stereotype. Audience reviews became their own fascinating layer of the film's story. I remember reading reactions online and being struck by the extremes. Some viewers hailed it as a masterpiece, praising its boldness, its feminist defiance, its surreal beauty. Others recoiled, calling it vulgar, grotesque, even unwatchable. The division was sharp, but what united all responses was intensity. Nobody seemed indifferent. Even those who hated it admitted they could not forget it, that it haunted them long after credits. That, to me, is the mark of powerful art. It refuses apathy. Critics, too, often emphasize the cast in their reviews. Emma Stone's performance was universally acknowledged as extraordinary, many calling it the finest of her career. Some noted the bravery of her nudity, not in the sense of exposure, but in the sense of vulnerability, her willingness to appear awkward, grotesque, unpolished. Others highlighted Ruffalo's comedic absurdity as a perfect counterpoint, or Dafoe's tragic grotesque as the moral anchor. What fascinated me was how reviewers so often described the cast as fearless, as though fearlessness itself were the theme. Perhaps that is what unites their work, the willingness to step into the grotesque without flinching. For audiences who loved the film, Bella became an icon, a symbol of unapologetic freedom. I saw a post celebrating her lines, her tantrums, her defiance. Viewers spoke of feeling seen, especially women who recognize in Bella's frankness a liberation they rarely encounter in cinema. For audiences who rejected the film, Bella became a provocation, a figure of excess, a reminder of discomfort they did not want to face. Both responses prove her power. She is not a character one forgets. She is a character who demands reaction. I think often about how the interviews and reviews together form another layer of the film's meaning. Behind the grotesque artifice are actors reflecting on their craft, audiences reflecting on their discomfort, critics reflecting on their categories. The conversation around the film becomes part of the film, another performance layered onto the original. That is what I love about cinema at its best. It spills beyond the screen, into words and arguments, into the lives of those who witness it. In the end, the cast of Poor Things gave more than performances. They gave themselves. Their interviews reveal not only craft but courage, their willingness to risk ridicule for the sake of truth. Audience reviews reveal not only judgment but vulnerability, their willingness to be unsettled and provoked. Together, they form a chorus of voices that echo the film's themes. Freedom, grotesque beauty, the refusal of shame. And it is in that chorus that the film finds its life beyond the screen, continuing to provoke, to haunt, to inspire, long after the lights come up in the theater. As I let my thoughts settle on this strange and unforgettable journey, I realize that no single description can capture the experience of living with this film. To watch it was to be unsettled, to be provoked, to laugh when I wanted to recoil when I thought I would laugh, to carry with me afterward a residue of questions rather than answers. That, I think, is what makes it remarkable. It does not leave you where it found you. It pulls you into its grotesque carnival, forces you to stumble with Bella across distorted landscapes, confronts you with contradictions too messy to resolve, and then releases you into your own life with new eyes. It is not a comfort but a challenge, not a story to be consumed and forgotten, but one that clings to you, that whispers its strange truths long after the credits fade. What strikes me most, after reflecting across its 13 steps of analysis, is how the film refuses simplification. It is at once satire and fable, grotesque parody and feminist defiance, philosophical allegory and surreal comedy. It is a story of liberation and of danger, of joy and of violence, of creation and of loss. Bella herself embodies this refusal, carrying within her the contradictions of innocence and experience, grotesque in beauty, victimhood, and defiance. She is not one thing but many, and in her multiplicity lies her truth. Watching her was like watching the human condition itself stripped of pretense, made raw, awkward, and luminous. The film's grotesque style, the warped sets, the garish colors, the distorted sound, becomes a symbol of the artificiality of the world itself, a reminder that society structures are no more natural than painted backdrops. In this exaggerated world, Bella's defiance shines all the brighter, her freedom all the more radical, because it exposes the absurdity of the rules that seek to contain her. I left the theater realizing that the grotesque was not decoration but philosophy, a way of showing that reality itself is strange, fragile, and constructed. The cast performances, fearless and unflinching, brought this vision to life with a kind of courage rare in mainstream cinema. Emma Stone's Bella will remain with me as one of the most unsettling and liberating characters I have ever seen on screen. Willem Dafoe's grotesque Baxter, Mark Ruffalo's clownish Duncan, Ramy Youssef's tender Max. Each brought their contradictions to the table, and together they created a world where no one is safe from exposure. Their work, along with the director's bold vision and the crew's meticulous craft, stitched together a film that feels as much an experiment as a grotesque science at its core. And then there's the cultural resonance, the debates, the arguments, the divided reviews, the audience reactions ranging from awe to disgust. That, too, is part of the meaning. The film does not exist only on screen, but in the conversations it provokes, in the discomfort it stirs, in the admiration it inspires. It becomes an event in our cultural life, one that asks us not only to watch but to participate, to wrestle with its contradictions. That is what great art does. It breaks the boundary between story and life, insisting on a response. What I carry with me, literature-loving friends, is not a conclusion, but a lingering set of provocations. What does it mean to be free? What does it mean to create? What does it mean to embrace contradiction rather than resolve it? Bella's journey does not answer these questions, but enacts them, living them in grotesque and beautiful ways. Perhaps that is why the film lingers so strongly. It does not hand us meaning, but asks us to make it ourselves. In the end, this film is not only about Bella, it is about us. Our laughter, our discomfort, our complicity, our longing. It is about the contradictions we carry in our own lives, the ways we stumble between innocence and experience, beauty and grotesque, freedom and fear. Watching it felt like holding a mirror I did not want to look into, and yet I could not turn away. That, to me, is the mark of art worth remembering. So I leave you here, with the image of Bella striding through a distorted world, unashamed, unapologetic, messy, radiant. She is grotesque, she is free, she is unforgettable, and as we step back into our own less colorful but no less absurd world, I hope we carry a piece of her defiance with us, a reminder that freedom is never neat, never safe, but always worth pursuing. If you enjoyed walking through this strange journey with me, literature-loving friends, I would be so grateful if you liked this video, subscribed to Cinema Vault, and stayed with me for more thoughtful dives into the world of film and literature.